The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. The Turn of the Tide, Volume 1. Introduction. After 200 years, the reputation of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire still stands high. For Hugh Trevor Roper, it remains the greatest historical work in our language. Footnote. H.R. Trevor Roper, Edward Gibbon, After 200 Years. The Listener, 22.10.64, page 617, end of footnote. The grandeur of its theme ranges over nearly 1,400 years of Western history, from the Antonine emperors to the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. Woven into its texture are the history of the early church, the dispersal of the Germanic peoples, the rise of Islam, the Dark Ages of Europe, and the Crusades, all of which Gibbon saw as elements in a continuous process of change and development. The classical oratory of its style never fails to offer unexpected pleasures, a flash of wit, a pointed epigram worthy of Tacitus, a touch of delicate humor, a thumbnail portrait painted with demure irony, and a dramatic scene eloquently presented. Then there are the notes, estimated at over 8,000. These are not only Gibbon's solid justification for his facts and the interpretation he puts on them, but reveal the man himself and the wide range of his interests, his engaging delight in information about travel and geography, natural history, antiquities, current affairs, and the oddities of men whose frailties fall victim to his sly ridicule, of whose misguided fanaticism meets with his scorn. We have to accept his idiosyncrasies and limitations. He shows no interest in music, art, or natural beauty, but we can only admire the clear, dispassionate intelligence which marshals the facts and presents the historian's personal viewpoint in the manner necessary to save his great work from being no more than a narration of events. The Decline and Fall is a watershed between the painstaking chroniclers and ecclesiastical antiquarians, and the historians of the Enlightenment, and after, some of whom were the doctrinaire thinkers and idealists whose purpose was to create a better world, and whose tendency was to brush aside what did not fit in with their theories. Voltaire had even said, "Malheur aux détails, c'est un vermin, quoique les grands orages." A curse on details, they are vermin which kill great works. Gibbon was not a philosopher in the French sense. He used the term philosophy to express his humanist belief in the rational thinking by which a man can rise above bigotry and superstition, and try to make sense of his experiences. So, too, the philosophical traveler means one who is observant, informed, and unprejudiced. Gibbon had no wish to reform society. He sought only to understand the rationalists and rationalize the past. After the decline and fall, the writing of history could never be the same again. The combination of philosophic history with the antiquarian's method of research became the aim which many of the best historians of the 19th century proposed to themselves. It is still the aim that many of us propose to ourselves. It means two different things: the constant repression of the priori attitude inherent in the generalizing approach of the philosophic historian, and, on the other hand, the avoidance of the antiquarian mentality with its fondness for classification and for irrelevant detail. Footnote: A. Momigliano, Ancient History and the Antiquarian. Studies in Historiography, London, 1966, page 25, end of footnote. Gibbon's classical model was Tacitus, the decisive authority, for whom his admiration was unreserved. Tacitus had set out to explain the moral decline of his own times by starting with the civil wars following the murder of Nero, the histories, and then going back to Augustus in the Annals, to show that the seeds of decay were sown when the one-man principate replaced the republican democracy. Gibbon, too, came to think that he should have chosen an earlier starting point than the Antonine Age. Both historians tended to idealize the virtues of the Roman Republic, but Gibbon is less relentlessly pessimistic than Tacitus, thanks to his Enlightenment background. Gibbon's modern mentors were especially Bayle and Montesquieu. Bayle was the first exponent of the skeptical approach to history, the empirical method which denied the possibility of absolute truth. His Dictionnaire historique et critique of 1697 taught Gibbon to weigh the validity of facts to be used as historical evidence, not allowing them to be perverted in the interest of religion or of national or human vanity. There are over 20 references to Bayle, all appreciative of his accuracy and learning. The great political thinker, Montesquieu, had written his own Considerations sur les causes de la grandeur des Romains et de leur décadence in 1734, in which he traced the collapse of the empire to its own immoderate growth that led to the corruption of the general spirit of the republic. This term Montesquieu defined and expanded in his major work, L'Esprit des Lois, 1748. A nation or society has a general spirit pervading all its aspects, and ideally its laws must conform with this. That is, he judged laws and institutions by reference to the social system in which they functioned, and to the geographical, economic, and historical factors created patterns of society. Montesquieu can therefore be considered the founder of the sociological approach to history. Gibbon refers to him some 50 times, and though occasionally critical of his lively fancy and inaccuracy, found him an excitingly liberating influence, freeing the philosophic historian from the total skepticism of Bayle and the metaphysical explanations of the churchmen. Gibbon left 6 incomplete drafts of the Memoirs, from which Lord Sheffield took selections for an autobiography, and which later editors have augmented and entitled Memoirs of My Life. They show how the decline and fall came to be written and what were the exceptional qualities which went into it: sustained concentration, retentive memory, intellectual honesty, and the capacity to see a way through a wood dense with trees. Gibbon was born in Putney on the 8th of May, 1737, the eldest child of Edward Gibbon and Judith Porton. 6 more children died in infancy, and his mother before he was 10. He himself was so puny and sickly that he survived only through the devoted care of his mother's sister, Catherine Porton, the dear Aunt Kitty, on whose death he was to write. To her instructions I owe the first rudiments of knowledge, the first exercise of reason, and a taste for books which is still the pleasure and glory of my life. Footnote. Letter to Lord Sheffield, 10th of May, 1786. End of footnote. His formal schooling was frequently interrupted, but he had freedom to read whatever captured his imagination. Pope's Homer and Arabian Nights, Dryden's Virgil. He then moved on to anything he could find on geography and world history, when he had the run of his grandfather Porton's library in Putney, and later that of his father's country seat at Brereton, near Petersfield. The future historian took shape more from the solitary boy's determined application, ill though he was, than from a succession of private tutors, and 2 broken years at Westminster School. Then his health improved, and was to remain generally good. His father decided to send him to Oxford, to Magdalen College, as a gentleman commoner. There he arrived in April 1752, just before his 15th birthday, with a stock of erudition that might have puzzled a doctor, and a degree of ignorance of which a schoolboy would have been ashamed. 18th century Oxford was no place for a precocious scholar, and Gibbon looked back on the 14 months spent at Magdalen as the most idle and unprofitable of my whole life. There was no sound teaching to improve his inadequate grammatical grounding, no stimulus to direct his eagerness to learn. Bored and lonely, still reading where he wished, his relish for religious debate, which had often baffled his aunt, took him to the writings of the English Jesuit Robert Parsons, and of the French Jesuit Bossuet, and these brought about his intellectual conversion to the Catholic Church. His angry father promptly removed him from Oxford and packed him off to Lausanne, in Protestant French Switzerland, for instruction and reformation by the Calvinist pastor Daniel Pavillard. This was most fortunate for Gibbon, if not at first any happier. He knew no French, lacked money and companionship, and the Pavillard household was austere and uncomfortable, but he was resilient. M. Pavillard wisely made no attempt to indoctrinate him, but trusted to his intellectual honesty to bring him to the Protestant way of thinking, and this was principally effected by my private reflection. From Protestantism, Gibbon moved away to the rational skepticism in belief were due to no one's persuasion, but to his independent logical thinking. M. Pavillard was a sympathetic and inspiring teacher and Gibbon was only too eager to consolidate his Latin and improve his rudimentary Greek, as well as to work on a planned course of geography, modern history, and the French classics. Within months, his French was excellent, and he had read all the major Latin authors. He was even able to correspond in Latin on textual problems with professors in Zurich and Paris. He began to enjoy Lausanne society, developed a love for the French theatre, and made a friend for life in young George de Verdun. His brief romance with Suzanne Curchod might have led to marriage if his father had not forbidden it because of his lack of prospects. It appears that Gibbon quite soon came to realize that he was better suited to a well-ordered bachelor life. Susan was later to marry Jacques Necker, the French Director General of Finance, and was the mother of Madame de Staël. In April 1758, Gibbon returned to England at the age of nearly 21 after almost 5 years of the fortunate banishment which had exchanged the port and prejudice of a stagnant Oxford for a French culture education which had been of incalculable benefit. It was to be some 12 years before he could start writing The Decline and Fall, but without that French education Gibbon would never have written it. European scholarship at the time was practically a French monopoly, and Gibbon's reading had taken in the best of the Age of Enlightenment at an impressionable time of his life. Many of the notes he would write referred to French authorities. The only writers in English to whom he gave more than passing reference were those of the Scottish Enlightenment, the philosopher David Hume, and historian William Robertson, whose History of England, 1754, and History of Scotland, 1759, he admired. He says that he left Lausanne more French than English, yet there is always something in his sturdy independence which seems to hark back to his forebears. The Gibbons were an old family of not particularly distinguished Kentish gentry. For instance, though he had the satisfaction of seeing the most extraordinary man of the age, and was civilly received by Voltaire in retirement outside Geneva, he was not unduly dazzled, and could later be critical of Voltaire's cavalier treatment of evidence. And though his mentors for The Decline and Fall were French, he shows an underlying pragmatic optimism which seems very English. Meanwhile, his first work was written in French, started at Lausanne, and dedicated to Suzanne Curchod. The Essai sur l'étude de la littérature was published in 1761. Its theme is the need to study literature as social history, to achieve a synthesis of classical learning and scientific enlightenment. Its model is Montesquieu. It appeared while Gibbon's time was taken up by the service as a captain under his father in the Hampshire militia, formed as a sort of home guard during the 7 Years' War. He took his books around with him and spent his spare time reading Cicero, philosophic works, Strabo's geography, and the Iliad, while on every march, on every journey, Horace was always in his pocket, and often in my hand. Again, it is typical of Gibbon to be optimistic about the value of his 2 years' service, the making me an Englishman and a soldier, quote, unquote. He even maintained that the discipline and evolutions of a modern battalion gave me a clearer notion of the phalanx and the legion. Footnote after the quote. But see E. Badian, Gibbon on War, Gibbon et Rome, à la lumière de la historiographique moderne, Geneva, 1977, pages 103 ff. End of footnote. As soon as the war ended and his father gave funds and permission, Gibbon set out on the Grand Tour, reaching Paris on the 28th of January, 1763. There he spent 3 months, combining the pleasures of cultivated society with visits to the public libraries and the Academy of Medals and Coins. It was then that he began to study the works of the Benedictine scholars of St. Maur Montfaucon's Paleographia Gratia, 1708, on the Greek characters, and Mabillon's De Le Diplomatica, 1681, which had laid down principles for establishing the authenticity of documents and chatters. He moved on to Lausanne to make new friends, John Baker, Holroyd, later Lord Shefford, in brackets, and William Guise, and enjoy the society of the Pays de Vaud for nearly a year, while preparing himself for his first visit to Italy. He worked on the topography of Rome, the ancient geography of Italy, and the science of metals, reading the best sources available, notably the travel books of J.B. D'Anville, the first of modern geographers, so often appreciatively quoted in his notes. Janus Grüter's Inscriptiones Antiquae Totius Orbis Romani, and the work on coins and metals of the Swiss Ezekiel von Spanheim. He had long since decided to be a historian, and during his militia days had toyed with ideas for a subject. A life of Sir Walter Raleigh, the invasion of Italy by the French Charles VIII, Florence under the Medicis, the history of the liberty of the Swiss, but all his earlier classical reading, and now his intensive studies, pointed in one direction. Years later, Gibbon recalled his decision as a flash of inspiration, though now it would seem to be more a crystallization of his thoughts. There are 3 versions of that famous moment, from which Lord Sheffield rose this one for the autobiography. Quote, "It was in Rome on the 15th of October, 1764, as I sat musing amidst the ruins of the Capitol, while the barefooted friars were singing vespers in the temple of Jupiter, that the idea of writing the decline and fall of the city first started to my mind." End of quote. Footnote. The church of Santa Maria in Aracoli is in fact on the site of the temple of Juno. End of footnote. The planned tour was cut short when Gibbon was recalled to cope with his father's failing health and mismanagement of his finances. The next 5 years, until his father's death in 1770, were the portion of my life, in quotes, which I passed with the least enjoyment, and it took another 2 disentangle the family affairs, and save what he could of his encumbered inheritance. He would not settle to any long-term project. Quote, "The decline and fall of Rome I still contemplated at an awful distance." End of quote. He started on the history of the Swiss, helped by George de Verdun, with the German sources, but soon gave it up. Fortunately, he sent the first chapters to Hume, who gave the sound advice that he should stop writing in French. He published a few learned articles and extended his reading. Now he could draw on the 22-folio volumes of the Jansenist Antiquarian Linan de Telemont, the Memoirs Ecclesiastiques, and the History des Empereurs on the first centuries of the Church. The scrupulous accuracy and diligence of his sure-footed guide are often praised. He also had Jean Leclerc's study on the authenticity of text, Ludovico Moratori's 34-folio volumes on the annals and antiquities of Italy, Cardinal Baronius' Annales Ecclesiastica, and many other learned compilations. Gradually, he built up a library which at his death contained about 7,000 volumes, including such unexpected subjects as the translation of the Bhagavad Gita, a 3-volume history of astronomy, Frederick II on falconry, a history of Sumatra, and the natural history of Norway. Footnote. See Geoffrey Keene's The Library of Edward Gibbon, London, 1940. End of footnote. Gibbon's original idea had been to write of the decay of the city of Rome. Then he explained his plan to cover the collapse of the Empire of the West, and after he had written the first volume, he decided to continue through the Dark and Middle Ages to the Renaissance. He started writing in October 1772, almost as soon as he settled into his new London home in the 7 Betinick Street. And despite an increasingly full social life at the London clubs, he published his first volume on the 17th of February, 1776. This took the history up to Constantine the Great, and ended with 2 chapters, 15 and 16, on the early Christians. It brought Gibbon immediate fame and quickly ran through 3 editions. But his, quote, candid but rational inquiry, unquote, into the origins of the Christian Church raised a storm of criticism from the clergy, which Gibbon had to answer in his Vindicatio. From 1774, Gibbon was a member of Parliament, first for Liskeard and then for Lymington. He never made a speech, but supported Lord North's government through most of the American war, and held a minor post in the Board of Trade, which increased his rather inadequate income by $750 something a year. He spent another few months in Paris at the invitation of the Neckers, enjoying his literary success and meeting celebrities. The encyclopedist de Lambert and Diderot, and the eloquent and philosophic Comte de Parfon, whose Histoire Naturelle satisfied his lively curiosity about such subjects as the giraffe, the camel, burning glasses, and the new and savage land of Guyana. Not surprisingly, the next 2 volumes were delayed until the 1st of March, 1781. They covered chapters, 27 to 38, ending with the disposing of the last emperor of Rome in 476, and Gibbon's general observations on the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. The much-quoted Scribble story exists in more than one version, but it was probably the Duke of Gloucester's remark on being presented with the second volume, "Another damn thick square book. Always scribble, eh, Mr. Gibbon?" Footnote. CDM Low Edward Gibbon, page 315. With the fall of the North government in March 1782, Gibbon lost his seat and his position in the Board of Trade. He decided not to seek re-election, but to join George de Verdun in La Seine and share his pleasant house on the edge of the lake. The two bachelors suited each other, and the next few years were some of Gibbon's happiest. He had completed his fourth volume before he reached La Seine in September 1783. It ended with chapter, I guess that is, I don't know, XLV11 VII, and dealt mainly with Justinian's legal code and attempt to reconquer the West. By then, Gibbon had covered about 450 years of his appointed period, and was left with 800 more to fit into 2 volumes and end at chapter LXXI, and the fall of Constantinople. They were written between 1784 and 27th June 1787, and all 3 were published in April 1788. At the start of chapter XLVIII, Gibbon set out his plan for dealing with such a vast amount of material. Instead of the earlier chronological record, which he feared would repeat a tedious and uniform tale of weakness and misery, I preferred, as I still prefer, the method of grouping my picture by nations, and the seeming neglect of chronological order is surely compensated by the superior merits of interest and perspicuity. In a single chapter, he runs through the emperors of the East, up to the Crusaders' outrageous occupation of Constantinople in 1204, and then paints the components of his picture: the Franks and Charlemagne, the Arabs and Mohammed, the Slavs, the Normans in Italy, the short-lived Latin Empire of the East, the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, the rivalries of the Western popes up to the 15th century. He surveys the whole medieval world west of India, and with the widening of his horizons, Gibbon often writes with a kind of elation, with zest for the opportunities given him to indulge his interest in remote places and exotic peoples. Yet the philosophic historian is always at work, setting out his evidence in a logical order of cause and effort, giving significance to his facts in the way which marks him off from the antiquarian or travel writer. Gibbon returned to London to see his 3 volumes through the press, and came back to La Seine to find Georges de Verdun seriously ill. He lived on alone at La Grotte after his friend's death in 1789, writing the drafts for his memoirs, enjoying his fame and his position in local society, welcoming English visitors and the refugees from France, including the Neckers. It is during this period that it is tempting to picture him as a slightly ridiculous figure, only 5 feet tall, increasingly fat dandified in dress, mildly flirtatious with his lady friends, complacent, and so set in his ways as to lack strong emotions. But this is caricature. With his perspective intelligence went a warm feeling for humanity, shown in his consistent opposition to slavery when Sheffield supported it. Gibbon always saw lack of political liberty as a fatal flaw in any society. He was, of course, a British 18th century Whig, believing in rational freedom for the enlightened upper classes, with no sympathy for a wild and mischievous system of democracy. And he had always criticized the dogmatic enthusiasms of Voltaire and his followers, the Gallic frenzy, the wild theories of equal and boundless freedom, which led straight into the atrocities of the French Revolution. The human suffering involved filled him with horror. His letters also show his kindly affection for his stepmother, Dorothea Gibbon, and his aunt Catherine Porton, whose death he felt deeply, and nothing could be better proof of his love and sympathy for his close friend than his immediate reaction to the news of Lady Sheffield's sudden death, which was to make the hazardous journey through Mainz and Brussels to offer comfort and support. He reached England in June 1793, spent the summer with Sheffield and the other friends, but by November a long-standing hernia could no longer be neglected. Twice the fluid was successfully drawn off, and Gibbon was optimistic of a complete cure, and a life of a further 20 years. But the third time, lack of antiseptic precautions took effect. Infection set in, and he died on the 16th of January, 1794, calmly and bravely, at the age of 56. Lord Sheffield had the coffin placed in his family mausoleum in the church of Fletching, Sussex, where a splendid Latin tribute can be read. The decline and fall of the Roman Empire is Gibbon's Monumentum Are Perennius. It is also a monument to the best of 18th century European learning, coming at a time when the Age of Enlightenment was about to yield to Rousseau and the Romantics, and before the great German scholars and archaeologists were to dominate the next century. There were earlier German works of scholarship which Gibbon could have made more use of. Winckelmann's History of Ancient Art, for instance, in French translation, if the arts had been among his interests. But the distinction between primary and secondary sources, which Niebuhr was to establish for all time, was not yet fully understood. Gibbon sometimes noted that coins and inscriptions provided valuable evidence where the literary tradition failed, and he used the best compilations available for his guides. But where he felt he could trust the transcription of a document, he tended to take the facts it related, however remote from it in time, as equally authentic. Gibbon's editors of later editions have pointed out occasional errors of fact. The temple of Juno on the Capitol, wrongly named that of Jupiter, the Euphrates, once called the Tigris, the Odeum of Pericles confused with that of Herodes, uncertainty on the origins of the Vandals, Ostrogoths, and Visigoths, miscalculations of mileage or of the extent of the slave population. Such details are of little importance in the context of the whole. More serious are certain inequalities and flaws which have been fairly criticized. Gibbon lacks sympathy with the elaborate ceremonial of the Byzantine court and with the abstract speculations of Eastern theologians. He never appreciated the fact that until the Crusaders of 1204 seized Constantinople, it was the greatest city in the world after Rome had collapsed, a bulwark against barbarian assault, and a bastion of ancient learning. He could have made more of the Slavs, and more of the work of Saints Cyril and Methodius, the apostles of the Slavs, in civilizing the Slav tribes, and giving them a Slavonic version of the Scriptures. His dislike of intolerance and extremism, when exhibited in monastic life, led him to deny credit to the monasteries for what they preserved throughout the Dark Ages. He was apparently unappreciative of the wisdom and humanity of the rule of Saint Benedict, and of the work of Cassiodorus, in encouraging secular as well as religious learning at Vivarium, and in establishing the monastic tradition of scholarship at a time when the secular world was crumbling around him. The criticism which greeted Gibbon's treatment of Christianity in his first volume rumbled on amongst churchmen through the editions of Dean Milman, 1846, and William Smith, 1862. Perhaps we are better able than the Victorians were to understand what Gibbon was doing, without being shocked where we do not agree with him. He never attacked primitive and uncorrupted Christian teaching, nor spoke disparagingly of Jesus, who has a rare mention at the start of chapter XLV11II. But he refused to put Christianity in a position of superiority over other forms of religion in which he was just as interested. Roman paganism, the cults of the primitive Germans, Islam, Zoroastrianism, as a deist and a skeptic, he believed religious truth to be unobtainable and indeed relatively unimportant. The Christian Church must be judged by its works and the good or harm it had done to mankind. That is, Gibbon treated all religions as social phenomena which ought to express the spirit and aims of a society, showing himself a true disciple of Montesquieu. The notorious chapters 15 and 16 are directed against institutionalized Christianity as an alien and divisive element in the Roman Empire, one which largely contributed to its downfall. The cheerful devotion of the pagans, with its practical emphasis on civic and marital virtues, had been a support. The antisocial intolerance with its practical emphasis on civic and marital virtues, had been a support. The antisocial intolerance of the Church, which exceeded that of any other religion in Gibbon's view, was destructive of the old values. The active virtues of society were discouraged, and the last remains of military spirit were buried in the cloister. Gibbon was very conscious of the power of religion on the individual, and fascinated by heresies and the minutiae of theological arguments, even when he most deplored the deluded enthusiasts who wasted time and even fought over them. With his humanist belief that society should aim at rational freedom and happiness for its members, inevitably he saw Christianity as neither rational, free, nor happy. Preaching and allegory led to a withdrawal from rational thinking, celibacy, and monastic seclusion were painful to the individual and useless to mankind. The Christian emphasis on sin and retribution and on preparation for the life to come robbed men of their human right to enjoy life here and now. Consequently, Gibbon devoted the main part of 6 of his chapters to an attack on the Emperor Constantine for establishing Christianity as the official religion of the empire, and Julian the Apostate was one of his heroes for this attempt to restore the old pagan worship. Traveling in Switzerland with M. Pavillard at the age of 18, Gibbon had been shocked by the Benedictine abbey of Einsiedlein. Oh, God. Einsiedlein. Einsiedln. By the profuse ostentation of riches in the poorest corner of Europe, and it was created by the potent magic of religion. As the decline and fall advanced into the Middle Ages, he showed himself fiercely anti-clerical in the manner of the French philosophies. It was his withering comments on the ambitions and corruption of the clergy, the ecclesiastical hierarchy and papacy, and especially on the monks of both East and West, which did most to damn him as an enemy of Christianity and give his work the reputation of a shocking book. In chapter LXIII, for example, we are told that the heads of the Greek Church were ambitious and fanatic monks, and their vices or virtues, their learning or ignorance, were equally mischievous or contemptible, while the asceticism of Mount Athos led to a mystic vision which was the production of a distempered fancy, the creature of an empty stomach and an empty brain. His treatment of miracles also gave great offense, as he attacked them from the standpoint of someone educated by the Enlightenment who accepted the Newtonian laws governing the universe. So in chapter 15, accustomed long since to observe and to respect the invariable order of nature, our reason, or at least our imagination, is not sufficiently prepared to sustain the visible action of the deity. Gibbon's ironic comments on clerical lapses, deceived husbands, and on colorful figures such as the Empress Theodora provoked his contemporary, the scholar Richard Porson, to remark on the rage for indecency which pervades the whole work, and later the critic Saint Beuve was to refer to his obstinate erudite et Freud. Gibbon defended himself by pointing out that anything which could be found offensive was relegated to the notes and often left in the obscurity of a learned language. Certainly he can appear to enjoy writing notes with a sexual innuendo, but he can surely be amused by his urbane mockery without finding it excessive or obscene. It is very much of his period, but quite free from anything gross or scatological, and far removed from the bitter satire of Pope or Swift. Here again, Gibbon is very French, and his model was Pascal. He writes that he reread the provincial letters every year, and learned to manage the weapon of grave and temperate irony. From Pascal, he learned that the most effective way to discomfort an opponent is not denunciation, but ridicule. Erasmus had used the same method. For instance, in the paragraph in chapter 6, page 134 of this volume, on James Macpherson's fabricated poems of Ossian, so hotly debated at the time, if we could with safety indulge the pleasing supposition that Fingal lived and Ossian sang, make it quite clear that Gibbon does not so indulge himself, while in the untutored Caledonians, glowing with the warm virtues of nature, he is teasing the Scots. His technique is often to make his point by no more than a neatly placed epithet, undercutting what is formal and pompous by the juxtaposition of an incongruous or deflating word or phrase. Cyril of Alexandria, in chapter XLVII, meditated the works of allegory and metaphysics, whose remains in 7 verbose folios now peaceably slumber by the side of their rivals. In the same chapter, in a note on the vision of a pretended angel, seen by an ambitious monk, we are told that his name of Timothy the cat came from his nocturnal expeditions. In darkness and disguise he crept round the cells of the monastery, and whispered the revelation to his slumbering brethren. A note in chapter XXVIII on the worship of saints and relics, that's 28, says that at Minorca the relics of St. Stephen converted in 8 days. 540 Jews, with the help indeed of some wholesome severities, such as burning the synagogue, driving the obstinate infidels to starve among the rocks, etc. Elsewhere, the most frightful imprecations on heretics are the charitable wishes of a Christian synod, and the deserts of Thebais swarmed with hermits. Gibbon's disingenuous assumption is that his readers will share his own rational skepticism and find it agreeable to do so. Naturally, his mock, serious tone could infuriate Christian apologists holding cherished beliefs. Gibbon elaborated a prose style in The Decline and Fall, which was in marked contrast with that of his unrevised memoirs and the lighter, more adaptable manner of his letters. As he says himself in the autobiography, quote, "The style of an author should be the image of his mind, but the choice and command of language is the fruit of exercise. Many experiments were made before I could hit the middle tone between a dull chronicle and a rhetorical declamation. 3 times did I compose the first chapter, and thrice the second and third, before I was tolerably satisfied with their effect." End of quote. Once he found the tone he moved forward confidently, planning his paragraphs with equal care and testing them by ear. The orotund Baroque periods owe a great deal to Cicero and to the great orators of the day, Burke and Sheridan, but the effective thrust of a pointed epigram is more reminiscent of Tacitus. In chapter 11, for example, such indeed is the policy of civil war, severely to remember injuries, and to forget the most important services. Revenge is profitable. Gratitude is expensive. Gibbon's antithetic or tripartite sentences, so much a feature of his style, and his richly Latinized vocabulary, have had their critics. Gilbert Hyatt, in the classical tradition, finds Gibbon monotonous while admitting that he is not unremittingly solemn. On the contrary, His text is sometimes elegantly witty, and his footnotes scandalously gay. Footnote. Chapter 18, Baroque Prose, page 344. End of footnote. Dickens seizes the opportunity to poke fun at the gorging Lord Mayor show of volumes in red and gold with purple ribbon bookmarks of Mr. Boffin's decline and fall of the Russian Empire. After 3 chapters read by Mr. Silas Wegg in a dry, unflinching way, Mr. Boffin, who sat intently staring with his eyes and mind at the confounding enormities of the Romans, was so severely punished that he could hardly wish his literary friend good night. Footnote. Our Mutual Friend, Chapter 5. Dickens reasonably makes the point that the sheer eloquence of Gibbon's style risks carrying his readers on too smoothly to be alert to what he is saying. Coleridge, too, complains that when I read a chapter in Gibbon, I seemed to be looking through a luminous haze of fog. Figures come and go, I know not why, all larger than life. But Mimnecker, Suzanne Kirchard, speaks for all Gibbon's admirers when she wrote perceptively on receiving his first volume. I see that he, Tacitus, was the model and perhaps the source of your work, but the source has been enlarged by the torrents of thoughts of all the ages. You show what a fertile and sensitive imagination can add to the depth and breadth of intellect. Without the working of that fertile imagination, The Decline and Fall would not be the noble masterpiece it is. There are great imaginative descriptions of the Temple of Apollo at Antioch, Daphne, in chapter 23 of the 5th century Christian Church, in chapter 28 of the final collapse of Constantinople, in chapter LXVIII, and desecration of St. Sophia, where a vast and gloomy silence prevailed in that venerable dome, which had so often smoked with a cloud of incense, blazed with innumerable lights, and resounded with the voice of prayer and thanksgiving. There are the masterly accounts of the primitive Germans and the nomadic tribes of the steppes in chapter IX and 26, and there are hunting phrases, Belisarius in chapter XLI, having to contend at the same time with the wind, the waves, and the barbarians, and one which echoes Montesquieu at the start of chapter XLVIII, where the Roman name is reduced to a narrow corner of Europe, to the lonely suburbs of Constantinople, and the fate of the Greek Empire has been compared to that of the Rhine, which loses itself in the sands before its waters can mingle with the ocean. Gibbon has been criticized for speaking of the triumph of barbarism and religion, or for giving a confused multiplicity of reasons for the fall of Rome. The epigram is oversimplified, and if the gates were left open to the invading barbarians because Christians were too preoccupied to defend them, that is only one amongst the many contributory causes, economic and socially divisive, which are still debated. But though The Decline and Fall covers the greatest, perhaps the most awful scene in the history of mankind, it is not a depressing book, thanks to Gibbon's humanist optimism about man's future in the world he knew. This can appear in unexpected places. When in chapter LXI he judged the 200 years spent on the wasteful years of the Crusades as having checked rather than forwarded the maturity of Europe, he could also see them as a social and economic turning point, undermining the Gothic edifice of oppressive feudalism and indirectly bringing benefit to the most numerous and useful part of the community. The conflagration, which destroyed the tall and barren trees of the forest, gave air and scope to the vegetation of the smaller and nutritive plants of the soil. Gibbon probably saw himself as one of a series of historians who work to rationalize the past, to bring order to the confusion of events, whose development was insensible, as he called it, to those who lived through them. But for us, Edward Gibbon is the greatest of the historians of the Enlightenment, the only one of them who is still read not only as a stylist but also as a historian. 2 centuries of massive scholarship and constant intellectual evolution have inevitably left many marks on Roman, Byzantine, and even more on medieval European history, but it remains a remarkable fact that anyone who wishes to study the later Roman and Byzantine Empire will still find Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire the best as well as the most readable narrative of it. Gibbon is the first great historian of a remote past whom the work of later centuries has not driven from the field. H. R. Trevor Roper. Introduction to the Gibbon in the Great History series.